It's a strange thing, seeing your land turned into someone else's vision without even being asked for permission. That's what John Anderson thought as he pulled up to the long driveway of his family's farm in Texas. His eyes locked onto the scene before him, a sprawling construction site with cranes and bulldozers tearing through the earth. It wasn't just 1 or 2 houses being built, it was 96. They must have gone mad, he muttered under his breath. His heart raced as he realized what was happening. They had started building the new Willowbrook Estates right on his property, the very land he had inherited from his grandfather. For as long as he could remember, this farm was home. He could still feel the echoes of his childhood here, the smell of freshly cut grass, the sound of the wind through the old oak trees, and the memories of his grandfather's weathered hands teaching him how to tend to the land. He had always known this day would come, but he never imagined it would feel like this, a complete violation of everything he held dear. John had worked hard his entire life, serving his country in the army, and had hoped to settle down on this land and carry on his family's legacy. But now, it was as if his home was being taken from him without so much as a word of warning. He stomped out of his truck, the gravel crunching under his boots as he marched toward the construction crew. The foreman barely looked up, his nonchalant attitude only adding fuel to John's growing anger. "We've got permits," the foreman said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "This is Willowbrook property now." John's mind raced. He knew the law, he knew the history, and he knew that none of this was legal. The land had been in his family for over 60 years. His grandfather, a proud Texan who had built the small farmhouse from the ground up, had passed down not only the land but also the rights to the water flowing through it. That was something the developers clearly hadn't accounted for. As John stood there, watching his memories being erased before his very eyes, the frustration began to mount. How could this be happening? Who were these people who thought they could simply take what wasn't theirs? He pulled out his phone and dialed his sister, Sarah, who was managing the property while he had been away. "Sarah, this is bad," he said, his voice tight with disbelief. "They've started building on the land, and no one bothered to tell me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "What are you going to do about it?" she asked, her voice full of concern. "I'm going to fight it," John replied firmly, already feeling the weight of the battle ahead. He had no choice. This wasn't just about land. It was about his family's legacy. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed stacked against him. He hung up and took a deep breath, looking out over the construction site. He wasn't going to let them get away with this. Not on his watch. John stood there, his boots planted firmly in the dust, staring at the construction site where his family's land was being taken from him. The scent of freshly laid asphalt filled the air, mixing with the earthy smell of broken ground. He was a man of patience, but this was different. He could feel the anger building inside him as he watched the bulldozers continue their work, oblivious to the man whose blood, sweat, and tears had built this land. The foreman didn't seem to care. He was just another cog in the machine, another worker following orders. John wasn't sure if it was the man's indifference or the sheer audacity of the situation that made his blood boil. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, trying to calm himself. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He pulled out his phone and dialed Sarah again. "Sarah, this is getting worse. They've already started building the houses. I need you to look through the property documents. See if you can find anything that might help." Sarah's voice crackled through the phone, sounding more stressed than usual. "I don't know, John. I've already gone through everything I can find. You need to get a lawyer, someone who knows land rights better than we do." John's grip tightened around the phone. A lawyer. He didn't need just any lawyer, though. He needed someone who could help him take back what was rightfully his, someone who understood the complexities of land ownership. The legal battle was going to be long, but he had no other choice. He had to protect the legacy of his grandfather and father. As he stood there, he thought about the years he had spent away from this land, serving his country in the army, and the sacrifices his family had made for this land to stay in the family's hands. His grandfather had worked the soil with his bare hands, teaching John everything he knew about farming and the importance of holding on to what was yours. The land wasn't just soil and grass. It was a living, breathing part of his family's history. John's thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice. It was Tiffany White, the president of the HOA, riding up in her golf cart. Her sharp eyes glinted behind oversized sunglasses, and she wore a smile that was anything but warm. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice sweet with a hint of mockery. "I'm afraid this land is now part of our Willowbrook Estates project. We've got everything we need to proceed, including the permits. You'll need to vacate the area. The homes are going up whether you like it or not." John stared at her, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He didn't trust her, and he certainly didn't trust the situation she had just described. He knew she was lying. He could feel it. "You can't just take this land," John said, his voice low but firm. "This land has been in my family for generations, and I will fight you on this." Tiffany smiled, almost as if she were amused. "Good luck with that. The city's already behind us, and we've got all the paperwork in order. I'm afraid you're out of luck." John gritted his teeth, but he didn't say anything else. Tiffany was right about one thing. He was going to have to fight for what was his, and he wasn't going to back down. John turned and walked back to his truck, his mind racing. As he drove away from the construction site, he knew that the legal battle ahead was going to be tough. But he wasn't going to let some greedy HOA tear apart everything his family had built. He was going to find a way to take them down, legally. This fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. John spent the next few days poring over every document he could find, flipping through stacks of old deeds, tax records, and maps. His eyes were starting to strain from the late hours spent hunched over his desk, but he couldn't stop. This wasn't just about land. It was about his family's legacy, and he wasn't going to let it slip through his fingers. His grandfather had worked this land with his bare hands, and John was determined to keep it in the family. He knew the battle ahead would be long and complicated, but he had to make sure he was ready. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the rolling hills of the property, John found something. It was buried in the bottom of an old file box, a deed from 1958, signed by his grandfather, granting him rights not only to the land but to the water that flowed through it. The document was a goldmine. John knew immediately that this was the key to fighting back. The construction of Willowbrook Estates was about to block the natural water flow from the creek that ran through his property, and this deed gave him the legal right to stop it. It was more than just an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to the delicate ecosystem his family had cultivated for decades. With the deed in hand, John contacted a lawyer, someone with experience in property law and land rights. The lawyer, a seasoned professional named Rick Thompson, listened carefully as John explained the situation. After going through the details, Rick leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "You've got a solid case, John," he said. "We can fight this, but you need to be prepared. These people are powerful, and they won't back down easily." John nodded, knowing full well the uphill battle he was about to face. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. He had no choice. He couldn't let Tiffany White and the HOA take what was rightfully his. He wasn't going to let them bulldoze his family's history for a profit. With Rick's help, John began drafting the legal documents needed to challenge the construction. They filed a petition with the court, citing the 1958 deed and the rights his family held over the land. The HOA, led by Tiffany, wasn't going to just roll over. They had already invested too much money in the project, and they had the support of the local government. But John wasn't intimidated. As the weeks went by, the tension only grew. John could feel the pressure mounting as the construction continued, and the deadline for the court case loomed closer. The stakes were high, but he knew that if he didn't take action now, he could lose everything. One morning, as John was on his way to meet with Rick, he received a call from his sister Sarah. "John, I've been going through more of Dad's old papers," she said, her voice tense. "There's something you need to see." John's heart skipped a beat. What else could they have missed? He quickly made his way over to Sarah's place, his mind racing. When he arrived, Sarah was waiting for him, holding an old leather-bound book. She opened it to a page near the back and pointed to a faded document. "This is another deed, John. It's from 1963. It's an agreement between Grandpa and the local water authority, giving him control over the creek. This could be the final nail in the coffin for the HOA." John felt a surge of relief wash over him. He now had even more ammunition to fight back. With this new document, he had the proof he needed that the HOA had no legal claim to the land or the water. He left Sarah's house feeling more confident than ever. The battle was far from over, but he knew he was on the right track. He wasn't just fighting for his family's land. He was fighting for justice. John stood in the courtroom, his heart pounding in his chest. The legal battle had reached its tipping point. He glanced around, his eyes briefly meeting Rick Thompson's reassuring gaze. The lawyer had been a godsend, helping him navigate the complexities of property law, but today was different. Today, it wasn't just about paperwork, it was about the fight for his family's legacy. He had prepared for this moment, but nothing could quite prepare him for the weight of the situation. Tiffany White and her team of lawyers sat across the room, their smug expressions a clear sign of their confidence. They thought they had everything in place. They thought they had the system on their side, but they didn't know what John had uncovered. The courtroom was silent as the judge walked in, a stern man in his mid-50s who had seen more property disputes than he could count. He settled into his chair and looked over the paperwork, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. John could feel his palms sweat as he waited for the proceedings to begin. This was it. This was the moment that would determine whether his family would keep the land or lose it to a group of corporate developers looking to turn it into another suburban housing project. The judge cleared his throat and glanced up. "Mr. Anderson, you may proceed," he said, his voice calm but firm. John stood up, his legs a little unsteady, but he squared his shoulders and walked to the podium. Rick gave him a quick nod of encouragement, and John began. "Your Honor, I stand before you today to protect the land that has been in my family for generations. My grandfather worked this land with his own hands. My father took care of it, and now I do the same. This is not just dirt and grass, it's our legacy." John paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. "I understand that the development of Willowbrook Estates is important to some, but it cannot come at the cost of my family's rights. The documents I presented today show that we have legal ownership of this land. It's not just a matter of who has the deed. This is about the rights that were granted to us through legal agreements that cannot be ignored." The judge nodded, flipping through the papers John had submitted. Tiffany White's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with a cold stare, stood up to object. "Your Honor, these documents are outdated," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "They are from the 1950s and 1960s, and they do not reflect the current zoning laws or the agreements made by the city. Mr. Anderson's claims are based on old paperwork that holds no weight in this court." John could feel his blood pressure rise, but he kept his composure. "What my opponent fails to understand is that these documents are not just old papers. They are binding legal agreements that were signed by my grandfather and the local water authority. They establish our rights over the land and the water that flows through it. The construction of Willowbrook Estates is interfering with those rights, and that's why I'm here today." The lawyer sneered. "Water rights? That's a stretch, don't you think? The city has already approved the project, and we've been working within all the legal guidelines." John took a deep breath and addressed the judge again. "Your Honor, the permits they are using were granted under false pretenses. The construction is happening on land that is legally mine, and I am here to make sure that the law is upheld. This is not just about money or development, it's about justice." There was a tense silence in the courtroom as the judge looked over the documents once again. Tiffany White shifted in her seat, her face a mask of frustration. She had thought she could steamroll John into submission, but it was clear that this wasn't going to be as easy as she had hoped. The judge finally spoke. "I will review these documents carefully before making a decision," he said. "This case is far from over, but for now, we will reconvene in 1 week." John sat back down, his mind racing. The waiting was the hardest part. He knew this wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a small victory. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to relax, just a little. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to give up now. He was going to protect what was his, no matter what it took. The following week felt like an eternity to John. Every day was spent waiting, reviewing documents, and preparing for whatever move Tiffany White and the Willowbrook Estates developers would make next. The pressure was mounting, but John had never been one to back down from a challenge. His family's land meant everything to him, and he wasn't about to let some corporate developers steal it out from under him. The day of the court reconvening finally arrived. John sat in the same courtroom, the weight of the past week's anticipation heavy on his shoulders. He could feel his palms sweat as he adjusted his tie, trying to maintain a sense of calm. Rick Thompson sat next to him, flipping through his legal notes, his face a picture of concentration. Tiffany White and her legal team entered the room, their usual smugness present, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes now. The stakes were higher than ever, and they knew it. The judge entered the room, his usual stern demeanor unchanged. The courtroom grew silent as he sat down and reviewed the files in front of him. Tiffany's lawyer, the same cold-eyed man who had objected last time, stood up first. "Your Honor," he began, "we are requesting that the case be dismissed. The land in question is already under the city's development plan, and the permits granted are in full compliance with local zoning laws. The claim to water rights made by the defendant is tenuous at best and irrelevant to the current zoning process." John sat straighter in his seat, but he didn't speak. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't the time to argue in the courtroom. He had already presented the documents. Now, it was about waiting for the judge to see the truth. The judge glanced at John's documents one more time, his expression unreadable. "I understand the claims made by both sides," the judge said, his voice firm but neutral. "However, after reviewing the evidence, I find that the legal agreements presented by Mr. Anderson do, in fact, hold weight. The 1963 Water Rights Agreement is a valid contract, and there are questions surrounding the validity of the development permits in relation to this agreement." John felt a rush of relief, but he didn't allow himself to show it. This was just the beginning of a long battle. Tiffany's face was a picture of frustration, her lips pressed tightly together as she stood to address the court. "Your Honor, we respectfully disagree with the court's interpretation of the Water Rights Agreement," she said, her voice cool and controlled. "The development is in the best interest of the community, and the defendant's claims are an attempt to stall progress." John stood up then, his voice steady as he spoke directly to the judge. "Your Honor, I'm not trying to stall progress. I'm trying to protect what's rightfully mine. This land is more than just property. It's a part of my family's history. My grandfather built this farm with his own hands, and I'm not about to let anyone take it away without a fight." There was a brief silence in the room. The judge nodded, acknowledging the passion in John's words. "I understand, Mr. Anderson," he said, "and I appreciate your dedication to your family's legacy. However, this case is about the law, and I will consider all factors before making a final ruling." The tension in the room was palpable as the judge leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. Tiffany's lawyer seemed ready to argue further, but the judge raised a hand to silence him. "We will reconvene in 1 week. Mr. Anderson, your case is strong, but there is still more to be considered. We will address the remaining issues at that time." John felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him, but he also felt a glimmer of hope. They had made progress. Tiffany and her team had underestimated him, and now they were starting to see that he wasn't going to be easily pushed aside. As he left the courtroom, he could feel the weight of the upcoming week on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long while, he felt confident that he could win this fight. He wasn't just protecting a piece of land. He was protecting his family's legacy. The next week felt like a roller coaster for John. The courtroom was packed as the final day of the trial approached. John had been preparing himself for the judge's decision, but there was no way to predict how things would turn out. He knew the stakes were high, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of clarity. He wasn't alone in this fight. The community that his grandfather had helped build, the land that had been passed down through generations, all of it was at risk, but John was not going to let it slip away. The courtroom doors swung open, and the judge stepped inside, signaling the start of the day's proceedings. John sat up straighter in his chair, his palms pressed against the arms of the wooden bench, waiting for the judge to speak. Tiffany White sat across from him, her usual confident smile replaced with a look of unease. She had always seemed so sure of herself, but now, with every passing moment, it was clear that her hold on the situation was slipping. "We are ready to proceed, Your Honor," Tiffany's lawyer said, standing and addressing the judge. The judge nodded, looking at both sides before turning his attention to John's lawyer. "Mr. Thompson, you may proceed," the judge said. Rick Thompson stood up, his calm demeanor providing John with a sense of reassurance. He had been in court countless times, but John could tell that even Rick understood the weight of this case. Rick addressed the judge with confidence. "Your Honor, as we have presented, the evidence shows that the land in question is not only legally owned by Mr. Anderson's family, but the rights to the water flowing through the property are protected by valid agreements. These agreements were made decades ago, and they remain intact. The city's approval of Willowbrook Estates, while legally granted, cannot override the established rights of the Anderson family. Tiffany's lawyer jumped up again, ready to counter. Your Honor, the city's development plans were made in full compliance with zoning laws. The fact that Mr. Anderson is claiming these water rights is irrelevant to the permits that were approved. Rick remained calm as he addressed the court. What we are asking for is not just the right to protect property. It is about ensuring that agreements made decades ago are not invalidated by developers looking to profit at the expense of the law. John sat quietly, watching as Tiffany's lawyer grew more agitated. His arguments were beginning to sound less convincing, as though he was trying to convince the judge of something that didn't hold up. The judge, however, remained impassive, reading through the documents and listening carefully to both sides. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge spoke. I have reviewed all of the evidence presented, and it is clear that the Anderson family's claims are valid. The water rights agreement made in 1963 holds weight, and the development of Willowbrook Estates cannot proceed without addressing these rights. John's heart skipped a beat. He could hardly believe it. Tiffany's face flushed red with anger, but the judge's words were final. The construction must be halted until a new agreement is reached. I will be issuing a temporary injunction to ensure that no further construction takes place on Mr. Anderson's land or in the affected areas. John let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It wasn't over yet, but this was the breakthrough he needed. The judge had ruled in his favor, and now, for the first time, he felt like the fight for his family's land was winnable. Tiffany and her team were visibly stunned, their confident facade shattered. John's victory wasn't just about winning in court. It was about standing up for what was right, for the generations before. Him who had worked the land with pride. As he left the courtroom, his steps felt lighter. He knew the road ahead would be long, but today, he had taken a crucial step in the right direction. The legacy of his family was intact, for now. The days following the judge's ruling were a blur for John. There was a sense of relief, but also a deep tension that lingered in the air. The temporary injunction had stopped Willowbrook Estates in its tracks, but Tiffany White and her legal team were not the type to give up easily. John knew that the battle wasn't over yet. It had only just taken a new turn. The injunction had bought him time, but that time needed to be used wisely. He spent long hours going over the details of the case with Rick Thompson, strategizing the next steps. They had won a crucial battle, but now they had to ensure that this fight didn't drag on for years in court. As the weeks passed, the situation began to feel more like a game of chess. Every move had to be calculated, and John had to make sure he didn't underestimate Tiffany or the city officials who seemed eager to see the development go through. The stress weighed heavily on him. He spent most evenings walking around the property, the sounds of nature filling the air as he tried to clear his mind. The land had always been his sanctuary, the one place where he could connect with his roots and forget about the outside world. But now, every inch of it felt like a battlefield. He thought about his grandfather and father, how they had both worked so hard to build something that could stand the test of time. John didn't want to be the one to let that legacy slip away. A phone call from Sarah brought a brief moment of clarity. John, I've been talking to some of the neighbors, she said, her voice filled with concern. They're worried about the property taxes if the land is stuck in this legal limbo. They don't want to be caught in the middle of a fight that could drag on for years. John sighed. He understood their worries, but he couldn't back down now. Tell them to hang tight, he replied. I'll take care of it. This is about more than just land. It's about standing up for what's right. He didn't know how long it would take, but he was committed. Weeks turned into months, and the legal battles continued. The city held meetings, trying to push forward with the development, but John's lawyers were relentless, digging deeper into the legal agreements and finding more cracks in the city's case. As the case dragged on, the pressure on Tiffany White grew. She was used to getting her way, but now she was facing a challenge she hadn't anticipated. John wasn't going anywhere. One evening, as John sat at his desk, reviewing the latest legal brief, he received an unexpected call. It was from Rick. John, we've got a chance to settle this, Rick said. I've been in talks with the city, and we might be able to reach an agreement that keeps the development at bay without dragging this through the courts for years. It's not ideal, but it's an option. John sat back in his chair, letting the weight of the decision settle over him. He had come so far. He had fought so hard for this land, for his family's future. But the idea of a settlement was tempting. It could end the fight sooner, bring some peace to the community, and prevent the development from destroying what his family had worked so hard to build. But it would also mean making compromises. What kind of settlement are we talking about? John asked, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. It would involve some concessions, but the core of the land, the water rights, would remain intact, Rick explained. We'd make sure the development is restructured in a way that doesn't impact the land you care about. The rest of the property could still be developed, but we'd ensure it doesn't encroach on your family's legacy. John thought about it for a long moment. The offer was tempting, but he couldn't help feeling like it wasn't enough. This was his family's land, and he wasn't sure he could trust the developers to honor the deal. I need to think about this, John said finally. Let me talk it over with Sarah and the neighbors. I can't make a decision like this on my own. He hung up the phone, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. It wasn't just about the land. It was about his family's history, and he knew he couldn't make a decision that would affect it all without consulting the people who had lived it with him. John sat on the porch of his family home, the warm evening breeze rustling the leaves of the oak trees that had stood watch over the land for generations. His mind was a whirlwind. The offer to settle the case was tempting, but something about it didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just about protecting the land. It was about preserving the spirit of his family's history, their connection to this place. He could hear the distant hum of construction machinery coming from the Willowbrook Estates site, a constant reminder of what was at stake. He took a deep breath and reached for his phone. He needed to talk to Sarah. When she answered, he could hear the concern in her voice. John, what did Rick say? Have you made a decision? John paused for a moment, looking out over the land. I'm not sure yet. The settlement offer could end this sooner, but I'm worried it won't fully protect the land. The developers could still do whatever they want with most of it. It doesn't feel like enough. Sarah sighed, and he could hear the sound of rustling papers in the background. I understand. I've been talking to some of the neighbors, and they're all worried too. We don't want to lose what we have, but we don't want this to drag on forever either. John felt a pang of guilt. He knew Sarah had been shouldering a lot of the burden, helping him handle things from afar. She had always been the practical one, the one who kept their family grounded. But this wasn't just about what made sense, it was about what was right. I know, Sarah. I don't want to make a decision without talking to everyone who's been involved. This is more than just a piece of land. It's everything we've built. He paused again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. I want to make sure the legacy of Grandpa and Dad is protected. We've worked too hard for too long. Sarah was silent for a moment before speaking. I agree, but maybe we need to be practical about this. The longer this drags on, the more the community will suffer. If we take the settlement, we might be able to find a middle ground, but we have to make sure we hold them to their word. John nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see him. I'll talk to Rick again. I'll make sure we can get some guarantees in writing, but I'm not going to let them just steamroll us. Not now, not ever. After ending the call, John felt a sense of resolve settle over him. He knew what he had to do. The settlement offer might not be perfect, but it was a step forward. He couldn't afford to let the fight continue for years, especially when so many people depended on the outcome. He stood up from the porch, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots, and walked over to the edge of the property. The land stretched out before him, quiet and still under the evening sky. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice, reminding him that family and tradition were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. It wasn't just about the water rights or the deed that had been signed so many years ago. It was about honoring the past while securing the future. The next day, John met with Rick once again. The lawyer seemed more relaxed this time, his face showing less of the tension that had been present in their previous discussions. I've spoken with the city, Rick said, and we've come up with a revised proposal. It's not ideal, but it's the best we can do without dragging this out for years. John listened carefully, nodding as Rick outlined the details. The settlement would allow the development to proceed, but with strict limitations on how much land could be developed and what could be done to the water sources. The deal wasn't perfect, but it would preserve the most important parts of the land, the parts that connected John to his heritage. After a long pause, John spoke. Let's do it. Let's make sure we get everything in writing. I'm not backing down, but this is the best shot we've got. Rick smiled and extended his hand. Agreed. Let's get this done. As John left the meeting, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. The battle was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, He felt like he was moving in the right direction. The legacy of his family and the land they had worked for so long would remain protected. It wasn't the perfect outcome, but it was the one that made the most sense. And for John, that was enough. The settlement was finalized, and John felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't the perfect resolution he had hoped for, but it was a win nonetheless. The development would continue, but the parts of the land that mattered most to him, his family's legacy, the water rights, and the heart of the property, were protected. John stood in the middle of the land, looking out at the horizon, the sun casting long shadows over the fields. He had fought for this place with everything he had, and now, for the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe. He walked to the edge of the property, the familiar crunch of gravel beneath his boots, and gazed at the Willowbrook Estates development just beyond the fence. The construction had resumed, but it no longer felt like an imminent threat. The developers had to follow the terms of the settlement, and John knew that meant they could no longer push him around. He could finally see the end of the tunnel. The next few days were spent cleaning up, meeting with contractors, and making sure everything was in order. He had to repair some of the damage caused by the construction, but it was nothing he couldn't handle. The land was still his, and that was all that mattered. Sarah came out to the property a few days later. She had been following the process from California, but seeing the land for herself gave her a sense of relief. She walked up to John with a smile. "So, how does it feel to be done with this?" she asked, glancing around at the fields. John smiled back, his face more relaxed than it had been in months. "It feels good. I can't say it's exactly what I wanted, but it's enough. We didn't lose everything. We protected what mattered." Sarah nodded. "You did good, John. I'm proud of you." John's heart swelled with pride. It hadn't been easy, but they had done it. Together, they had stood up to the forces that tried to take away everything their family had worked for. The next few weeks were spent adjusting to the new normal. The land was quieter now, and John had a sense of peace knowing that he had done what was necessary to preserve his family's legacy. The developers had moved forward with their project, but John's land was safe, the water flowing freely through the creek that had been the lifeblood of the property for so many years. It wasn't the way he had imagined things would turn out, but sometimes compromise was the best option. He wasn't just fighting for land. He was fighting for a piece of history, a piece of his family's story that couldn't be erased. And in the end, that was enough. As John stood on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The fight had been long and hard, but it had been worth it. He had his land, his family's history, and the knowledge that he had done everything in his power to protect it. And for John, that was the greatest victory of all.